Hello, it's Dr. Mike, and we are beginning week one of Management 300, and I'm excited to be able to talk to you about some things today that will prove to be very helpful, I think, as you go forward in your career and maybe rise to the level of management. At least some things that you need to be thinking about as far as career and the things that you do as an employee. As I said in our introduction, I don't think that we give very much thought when we're not in management to the things that go on to make a company what it is. And I think we've been made to think about that probably more recently with the COVID-19 virus. And we've been made aware of just the kind of decisions that happen in a business under duress. And many of you have been without jobs and furloughed at home and all those kind of things. That these are corporate decisions that have to be made, and they are viable to our health and our long suffering and our long-term goodwill. And so, but they have had a marked effect upon the business world as we have watched businesses grind to a halt. And so the question that we need to think about is, where are all of these decisions made? How are they made? And if you were a part of management, what kind of decisions would have to be made? You know, we don't think about that when we're just an employee, but there are a lot of things that have to be determined on a day-to-day basis that will prove to affect every person in the organization. So I don't have time today to go through each of the chapters in detail. I just want to go through and mention some things to you in the way of terms, because I feel like if I do not, then you'll be overwhelmed and not read the material. And I encourage you to read the material, peruse the books, come back to them. Some of these you may want to keep for future reference, but you do need, while you may not hold on to everything that we talk about or the book talks about, you will at least need to be familiar with it as you go into the corporate world. The first thing we want to talk about today is the global business environment. And when you're 63 years old, you have a kind of a better view of that probably than an 18-year-old, because we don't understand. A lot of people today have never lived in a world where we were not so globally connected with technology, with computers, all these other things, and with business, because we are dependent one upon another. It's no longer our country being solely self-dependent. We get a great deal of our stuff from other places, even to manufacture the things that we do manufacture here. Interestingly enough, the West, and that includes Great Britain and America, we don't produce a lot of new things. It has been historically our process to adopt and adapt. We adopt things from other countries, and we adapt them to fit new ideas. That was true of the printing press. Gutenberg did not invent the printing press. He invented movable type, but we got the printing press from the Chinese. We adapted it to movable type, and it became the thing that drove the Industrial Revolution, the Age of Enlightenment, the Reformation. All of those great periods of history were driven by that one thing, that was getting out information through printing and people reading, of course, and all of those things. And so we tend to do that. We did that with gunpowder. The Chinese used it for fireworks. They used it for medicine. We adopted it, but we adapted it to make weapons from it. So that's kind of been our history. But that goes to say that we are tremendously globally connected today, and there's nobody that goes it alone, because we have, even in this country, we have foreign car companies and many others that are functioning, that give us jobs. And I worked for BMW for 10 years in Greenville, South Carolina. So let me just introduce you a little bit to the global business environment. How do businesses exist? That's a question that we have mentioned already. Are they in isolation? I mean, you work for a company. Is that company connected to other companies, to other countries? Rarely you'll work today for a company that does not have outside connections to the rest of the world. It's much more an ecosystem that we function. We get parts, we make sales, We do all of those things interconnectedly. And so the world's a lot smaller place than it was, say, 20 years ago, 30, 40 years ago. Who's involved in that process? Even if you're working in the most simple jobs, there are a lot of people, a lot of pieces in that puzzle that are networked together. The other thing that we have learned so clearly recently is that the landscape of business can change so quickly. You think about shutting down the entire business process of the world, which we have done in the last few weeks because of the COVID-19 virus. What does it take to get that up and running again, which is the thing that most world leaders are trying to figure out now without a bigger problem than they started with? How do we get started? We don't just jump back into where we started from. My brother works for Michelin Tire. He was telling me today that they are not probably going to work again until after the 4th of July, but they're starting it up one module at a time. And so they're going to be working on short-term projects, trying to get back up again, making tires because, the tire business, the bottom has just fallen out of it. One of the terms that you need to be aware of is the term globalization. It refers to the integration, the interdependence of economic, technological, sociocultural, political systems across diverse geographic regions. We're no longer working in the backwoods of South Carolina, where I'm from, or for many of you, the backwoods of West Virginia. We have outside interconnected operations. We work with all kinds of people, very diverse people, very people that are diverse in language and culture and food and every other thing you could think of today. We're very diverse people, and we're no longer just people in the backwoods that nobody knows about. When BMW came to Greenville, South Carolina in 1996, I helped them start the car plant there and was one of the first employees. But they brought diversity, and they jerked us into the 21st century when it came to technologies, and all these things were vitally important. But we live in a globalized economy, and so when something happens halfway around the world, like in China, it's not long before it affects the United States or Canada or any of the other trading partners that operate with those countries. We hear a lot of talk about global trade agreements now that we have going on around us. NAFTA, GATT, European Union, all those are trade alliances, and they have to be renegotiated at times and rewritten and re-signed. And so those are the agreements we have among our partner nations that we work together and try to help each other to be successful. You have terms today like tariffs, and our president has put tariffs on various goods that are coming in from outside to slow those down and to help us manufacture. But there's a lot more factors to that than just, hey, we need to put a tariff so that we can make more. That's very true in the automobile industry because American-made cars have not done well in a number of years. That's a quality issue. It's not about so much cars from outside unless they put a tariff on them and force us to buy American cars instead of BMWs or Mercedes or Volkswagen or Volvo or any of the others. So tariffs, that's a debatable issue as to whether that is a good thing or a bad thing, whether it hurts American jobs or it helps them. We talk about gross national product, how much we are producing. It's one of those figures that we in business measure. And of course, growth is a very important part of what we do. One of the terms that we use often is the term comparative advantage, and that's one thing that we need to think about. Countries engage in the production of products, and comparative advantage says that we should engage in those products that we can do the most efficiently. That is the theory of comparative advantage. If every country would do do what they do best, those things they can do the most efficiently, make the most money, then that should raise the ships of everybody. It should improve everyone's financial abilities. But instead, we try to get very complicated, and we have to have these parts and pieces from all over the place. And so we don't often think about that, but those are the things that are easiest for us to produce. That is an economic theory that's important. It suggests that free trade leads to a more efficient allocation of resources because free trade encourages countries to specialize in the production of products for which they have the lowest cost producers. As a result, all countries involved in trade benefit from access to cheaper products. In general, free trade between nations can lead to lower prices, more employment, higher output, and a higher standard of living for those in developing countries. And of course, since we are so interconnected today, the lifestyle and the livelihood of other countries are exceedingly important, or should be, because we're all so interconnected. In the instance we talk about the COVID-19 virus, most of the countries that will suffer the most from that will be countries that don't have the medical facilities and the abilities that we have because they're economically behind. They don't have the ability to produce and to take care of their people and feed their people and all these other things that go into that, into a pandemic. And of course, we'll be talking about that for the next 20 years. The other thing we need to think about is the external environment of business. The external environment of a business, that you work for, represents all the external forces that affect that firm's business. And it's significant in its influence. For instance, if you work in healthcare, many of our students in Valley College do work in healthcare. It's not just the owner of that company that you have to deal with, or they have to deal with people. They have to deal with government forces that regulate the business, and they have significant influence over how you service your clients, how you take care of people, how you document the medicines you give and the treatment that you give in healthcare. And if you're going to be an administrator in a nursing home, for instance, or a hospital, you are going to have to be very cognizant of the external environment that goes on, the regulations, if you will, that keep you certified and keep you able to do your job, or else you will be out of business. There are a lot of other factors that will influence the external environment. Things like technology. Technology has become the elephant in the room in the last 20 years. It has taken over so much of what we do. Some of you probably don't even remember the day when we had to do written records, and medical records were in folders and files and not on computers, and you did thermometer, you did temperature checks with a thermometer, sometimes rectal, sometimes oral, but you had to write all those things down, and the chances of mistakes go along with that. Competition has a lot to do with that. Think about if you were the owner, or you're on the board of McDonald's, for instance. You realize McDonald's is an international firm, and they have all kinds of restaurants but in each country, they will have to do a few things differently than they do in America, because not everyone has the same likes and dislikes. I was in Jerusalem a few years ago. Instead of McDonald's, they have a McDavid's, and in that restaurant, they serve something very different because sometimes they have religious restrictions on what they eat as a people. For instance, Muslims and Jews don't eat pork, and so you don't find sausage biscuits necessarily in a McDavid that you would find in a McDonald's. But all those decisions have to be made at a very high level, because you don't just open a restaurant and say, oh, they'll come. You've got to plan. Planning is going to be, as a administrator and in management, planning is going to take up most of your work life, because you've got to plan. And you're not planning for tomorrow and the next day. You realize that managers are planning right now for June and July or August on how they're going to get their company back up and running again and bringing it from ground zero back into the mainstream. So these external factors are going to be a very big part of that, because you have got to find suppliers. You got to be sure your supply chain is back online. Recently, Wendy's had to take chicken from their menu, or hamburgers from their menu, because they could not get beef. There's a beef shortage, and there will be for the next coming months. So many of the restaurants like that have to take into consideration, what are we going to sell? Can we make it on chicken? Can we do it on this, do it on that, because they don't have access? So all these things are managerial decisions at the highest level. Then there are internal environment factors. That consists of a lot of dimensions that affect the firm from within its own boundaries. The typical components of a firm's internal environment will include the owners and the board of directors and employees and culture. Each of these dimensions can directly impact that firm's performance and competitive position. You know, most people that work for a company will say, if they're not in management, they will say, we need a raise, or why can't they give us a raise? They're making all this money. But you don't realize where that money goes and how it's utilized to keep the company. They can't give away everything because there's no point in running the business if you're not going to make a profit. There's a lot of things to think about in that. The next chapter that I want to just briefly mention to you is the one on ethics and corporate social environment. As you work in management, your values will often come in conflict with others. That's a big deal today. We seem to have uncovered every crack in the pavement when it comes to things we hoped we had settled, whether it be race or religion or women's rights or gay rights or whatever those things are. But we seem to have just shattered all of the ground that we've gained. But the question is, when you go into a workplace, especially in management, you in particular will have to deal with a lot of the ethics and the things that go on there and how you treat everyone fairly. Everyone has a right to be treated fairly, regardless of their religion or their sexual preference or anything else. There are no ifs, ands, and buts about that. Every person has a right to the freedom to choose and to be treated fairly in the workplace. As a manager, you're going to be held accountable for that. Every job that I interview and onboard for these days, you have to take ethical and management ethics training and on how to treat people. Your personal values, your beliefs, and your ethics are going to help you to navigate some very difficult decisions. If you have an ethical problem with the company that you work for, if they're not doing things accordingly as you think they ought to be done honestly, then you do always have the option to leave. Don't sell your soul to the devil. We all have to deal in big corporations with things that are unusual and different to us. I never forget in BMW, it's always, the words were always, you need to learn to think like a German. And so they did think very differently. People from other countries think very different. People from other states think very differently than people in South Carolina, West Virginia, Ohio, wherever you're from. At its core, ethics is the study of moral standards and their effect on conduct and behavior. And you don't have to be religious to be moral. Morality is defined as the standards that people use to judge what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is evil. So take just a moment and ask yourself that question. What is your standard? How do you determine what's right and wrong? How do you determine what is good and evil? If there is evil in the world, then there's good. If there is right in the world, then there must be wrong. And how do we determine what's right, what's wrong? Those are questions as a manager that you will find to be very important. We use a lot of ethical frameworks to determine those. Probably one of the biggest in the business world is the law. And the law is important because it sets certain corporate values or values that are enforceable, these rules, and they apply to everyone. So most people will resort to the law if they don't resort to anything else. Just because something is legal, though, does not make it right. And you need to think about that. In the past, we used asbestos in insulating our buildings. It caused lung cancer. And for a long time, we knew that it caused cancer, but we did it anyway because it was the cheapest way to insulate a building. Is that right? Is it right to kill someone else because it's cheaper? The other thing that we have had that was legal was racial segregation, segregating of the races in this country. And I lived through much of that as we desegregated our schools and different things. But it doesn't make it right because it was done. There are a lot of things that may be legal, that may not be ethical. And so you have to think about those things in terms of how you react to other people. Letting other people have as many freedoms as they can enjoy without impacting yours or yours impacting theirs is a huge issue. We're fighting that now over something as silly as wearing face masks. People say, well, that's my right. But the question is it your right? Is it your right to maybe spread germs that kill somebody else because you don't wear a face mask? Your freedom ends where my nose starts, basically, is what we need to think about. The other ethical framework that's often used is called utilitarianism, $50 word, but it means the greatest good to the greatest number of people. Thomas Jefferson believed that when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. He talked about everybody having life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that last one has to do with utilitarianism. If you teach American history like I do, you realize that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which did ensconce slavery, meant very different than what we often think it does. Life and liberty, liberty was not given to slaves. It wasn't given to Native Americans, wasn't given to women, and was only given to men. They could only vote if they owned a certain amount of land. And that went on until 1828 with Andrew Jackson. But Jefferson believed this idea of the pursuit of happiness. A company that seeks to only pursue the greatest good for its shareholders does not often do the same for its customers or those people outside. They can do a lot of economic harm, as we have seen. I worked for Schlumberger International, and we dumped PCBs into Lake Hartwell in upstate South Carolina and destroyed that lake for years. It will never be good for fishing or not really good for swimming because of the carcinogens that we dumped into the lake because they cause cancer. And so we were doing right by our shareholders and the people that own the company and making the very best money for them we could make, but we were killing our own environment. We tend to do that. So ethical frameworks will come into play in a lot of management decisions in the business world. All those things feed into an idea of strategy. As a manager, as a part of a management team, which is probably what you would be, you have to decide the strategy of how you're going to run the company and the directions you're going to go. And to succeed in a constantly changing contextual landscape is difficult. I mean, right now you can understand that because, I taught students this semester who suddenly had to uproot from being in a classroom to go into online. The context changed, their education continued, but they had to make decisions based on that change of context. It didn't matter whether they liked online classes or not. They didn't have a choice. And that's kind of how it is in the business world because the context can change. We're going along fine, and suddenly a virus, a flu virus, completely knocks us out of the saddle and does something to our country that we haven't seen since 1918 with the Spanish flu pandemic when they lost 50 million people. But a firm has to develop and execute a defensible strategy. At its core, strategy includes pursuing a set of unique activities that provide value to customers, making trade-offs about which businesses to pursue, what products to produce, which customers to serve, and aligning our resources to achieve organizational objectives. Now, we've gone through a terrible business upset in the last few weeks. As you look around, which businesses do you think had a strategy in place before this happened? For many, this pandemic caught businesses off guard and unaware without a strategy. I look at Chick-fil-A. I'm not sure how many of those you have in your area, but Chick-fil-A almost never missed a beat. They continued change their business model to drive-through, set up ways to protect people from being infected, and ran their business. And of course, I'm sure they lost business not having a dining room, but they weren't caught off guard. They had plans in place. That's probably the most efficiently run companies in the country. And the same thing with places like Starbucks. Others didn't. Others are, flitting around for 2 weeks trying to get something together because they'd never done drive-through, they'd never done call-in, never done takeout. Those are the ones that have struggled. And schools, which had never done online training, found themselves struggling because they did not have a strategy in place. Those schools that already had online classes have done very well. It didn't take much to convert them over completely to an online environment. A firm has to achieve competitive advantage by creating more economic value than its competitors, by engaging in a strategy that is difficult and impossible for others to duplicate. A lot of different companies will have different mindsets and things or values or worldviews that will influence it. Chick-fil-A, Hobby Lobby, all these things will come into play. And so they can react in a changing environment. At the same time, they have to remain stable. That's very difficult to do. And if you're a manager, you're going to have to deal at some point with stability within your company. So let me mention to you about strategy as you read the chapter. Pay attention, if you will, to some of the important things here that will help you to understand better. The history of strategy, the strategic framework of a company. Usually when you're onboarding, you're a new hire, you're going to be taught things like corporate vision. Pay attention because becoming a part of a company often means that you buy into that vision. So vision, mission, objectives, and then strategy formation. How do they form the strategies that will make the company stable and will work? Finally, the last two things, there are different levels of strategy. The business level will be talking about competitive advantage. How do we compete? And when you set this strategy, a manager is going to evaluate all kinds of these things as we look at how we're going to function. A lot of those things will be things like low cost. How do you produce things at the lowest cost possible? Or differentiation. How do you diversify and do things a little bit differently and better than your competitor? And what is our focus? Keeping your eye on the ball is integral to all of that. The corporate level is a much higher level, and it usually applies to companies that operate several businesses within the framework, and they're looking for industries that are attractive. What should they be in? How should they allocate their resources among those businesses? And in summary, the corporate level strategy is a way a company seeks to create value through configuration and coordination of many multi-market activities. So as you think about that, as you read these chapters, meditate upon that. So just for closing thoughts for week one. Number one, the lecture quiz does not come from these slides. You can feel comfortable in taking that because it is very generic about what did you learn, what did you take away, what questions do you have, that kind of thing. So don't feel like you can't take the quiz, or it's going to be some long, overdrawn quiz from all of these notes. None of that is true. As you go through your materials this week, I trust that you will spend some time thinking about all of these things, these forces that you're going to be involved with in the business world in such a changing environment. And so I hope you'll come back to these ideas as you move forward in your career. If you have any questions, please contact me and let me hear from you as you need it. Thank you.